Now, Mark, I believe you coined the term for the latest and most recent generation, Generation Alpha, those born between 2010 and 2024. Why did you do this, and tell us what defines Gen Alpha? This morning, our guest is Mark McCrindle. His passions lie in tracking social trends, communicating insights, and generational analysis. I'm Ian Bunston. Welcome to Monday Matters. Welcome, Mark. Great to have you as our guest this morning.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be with you.
Mark, I believe that McCrindle's celebrating their 20th birthday soon. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yes, we've just clocked up those 20 years since it was just me out there with a few ideas and a plan, and it's been great to have served clients and not-for-profits and churches over these 20 years. So that's where we're now at.
What a wonderful journey it's been for you all. Mark, for those who may not be fully aware of the extent of what McCrindle does, can you just give us a brief overview of the organisation? I have alluded to it a tiny bit in the introduction, but if you can unpack that a bit for us, it'd be great.
Sure. Well, we're all about giving people evidence bases on which to make their decisions, to communicate important information in engaging ways so that leaders can understand the times and respond proactively and strategically. And often that involves gathering research through national surveys. Sometimes it's through focus groups or in-depth interviews, what we would call qualitative research. Sometimes it's demographic analysis of our population or other data sets to look at where we're at, how we've changed, the projections or modeling in terms of where we're going. So that's what we try to do. And it provides a snapshot of for organizations or industries, sectors, churches, or communities. Where are we? How have we changed? Where are we going? And what do we need to do to respond? So we collect that data, communicate those insights, and then guide the journey for organizations in terms of how they might respond to these changing times.
Very interesting work indeed. Now, Mark, I believe you coined the term for the latest and most recent generation, Generation Alpha, those born between 2010 and 2024. Why did you do this, and tell us what defines Gen Alpha?
Well, I've been studying the generations well for these 20 years or a little beyond, and that's because one of the best ways to understand our times, our communities, our world, our client base or our team members is by looking at the generations. Because we are who we are in our generations because of our age or life stage. That's much of what a generation is. Those of us in our 40s or 50s, the Gen Xers are going to be different to the millennials or Generation Y in their 30s. They're going to be different to those children today. Life stage means a lot, but it's more than that. It's also the times that shaped us mean that we're different to perhaps the previous generation of adults that went before, or we're different to we were different in our youth to the next generation coming after in the 21st century in which they're being shaped in their youth. So the times, the events, the technologies, the experiences, the social markers, all of that leads to differences across the generations as well. So it's more than just age. And that's why understanding our generation is a multifactorial way of understanding segments or groups or cohorts in society. That's why we've been studying the generations a lot, and so having a good understanding of baby boomers, then Generation X, and then we studied Generation Y as they came through, and then Generation Z, who were born since the mid 1990s, now in their 20s. We looked at all of these generations, and we realized that we had come to the end of the alphabet with X and Y and Z. Where are we going to now? Each of these generations spanning 15 years of births. So from 1995 through to 2009, that was the end of Generation Z. What's next? And we were looking at this in the early 2000s and said, well, we need a new label because there's a new generation starting in 2010. We don't want to go back to A because this is not a return to the old. This is the first generation to be fully born in the 21st century, born from 2010. It's the first generation to be fully raised digital in these worlds of devices and social media apps and smartphones and everything else. So let's move to a different naming classification. Let's move from the English alphabet to the Greek one, and that's where we put forward the term Generation Alpha, with 15 years after the Alphas, Generation Beta, and then Generation Gamma and Delta, and hopefully that labeling will allow some continuity, some similarity of naming, some degree of predictability into who's coming next. And we put that forward, and that seems to have stuck as the global labels around the generation. So that's where it came from, and that was the reason for it.
Mark, this year, 2025, marks the beginning of a new generation in Generation Beta. In fact, I've got two grandchildren that have been born this year, but they're going to fit into this particular gen. Simply put, Generation Beta is defined as those born between 2025 and 2039. Can you describe the characteristics of what this group is going to look like?
Mm. Yeah, we can, even though they're not all born yet, and even though those that are very young, we can because we can understand, again, as I said, the times that are shaping them. And clearly, they're globally connected times, they're digitally enabled times. We're seeing formal education rates rise. Even in developed countries like Australia, we're seeing young people start education early now, a big push to early learning, even before school at age 5. We're seeing students stay in school after year 12, going on to tertiary studies in record numbers, so they'll be more formally educated. We know that we're seeing a longevity boom. And not only that, but with longer years of life, particularly in a knowledge economy, we'll have longer years of working as well. They'll be able to work well past traditional retirement age, and many will want to as well. So we'll see them live longer and work later. We'll see them as more mobile in terms of moving where they work or study or connect. They'll be multi-career in outlook because it's not the same tenure of employment that we have today. People move more frequently, and it's not job for life. These will be lifelong learners. We also know a lot about them, not just because of the times that are shaping them and those broader social or educational trends, but because of the parents and their attitudes. And the parents of these Gen Betas are now Generation Z. So you were just discussing the Gen Alphas born from 2010 through to 2025. So their parents are the Generation Y, or they're also known as the Millennials, if you've heard that term. So that's just a generation is 15 years, but the average age of a woman in Australia giving birth is 31 years. So in other words, to know who the parents of today's generation are, you don't go up one, you go up two. You skip a generation to work that out. You go 30 years, not 15 years. So, in other words, the parents of the Gen Alphas are the generation that went before Gen Z. It's the one that went before that, Generation Y. So, we know a lot about these Gen Betas because we know about their parents, which aren't the Alphas, they're the Gen Zs. And what we know of these Gen Zs is they now turn 30 at the oldest edge and move into those key and peak fertility years, is that they have grown up with technology themselves and they're more tech skeptics than tech optimists. They're not seeing the future as wholly giving technology to these children. They're parenting a little bit differently to the ones that have gone before, where they're actually dialing down that technology and trying to get their children out in terms of more holistic development off screens, not just doing everything on the screen. So even that is shaping how they're being raised a little bit to how the Gen Alphas were raised. So by looking at the context, the parents, the times, the trends, the events, the experiences, all of that gives us a sense of what the next generation will be like and how they'll be shaped.
Now, Mark, there's often rivalry amongst generational groups. We have this discussion sometimes around the dinner table and can make for a very interesting conversation. Which generation do you think has had it the toughest?
We just did some analysis of this, and it was fascinating to see. We looked at all the generations, and from an economic perspective, from a financial perspective, it was fascinating to see. So when we looked at the baby boomers, particularly if we look at when the baby boomers were really starting their economic life in the early 1980s, as they were getting households and looking at buying homes and that sort of thing. We had interest rates hit double digits, and many listening here will actually remember that, not just from history, but from their own experience. And it got up to a little over 17%, that house loan rate, pretty incredible. We had unemployment that was in the double digits for a while there as well. We had global uncertainties from the oil crisis of the 1970s to the recession of 1989 through to 1991. We had the early 2000s, the tech bubble crash. 1999, things were looking good with tech, and then 2000, they all sort of fell off a cliff there for a little while, and even in 2001, the September 11 tragedy, and so that was in the peak growth years, and then even in those earning and peak wealth accumulating years of the baby boomers, and just as the Gen Xers were starting as well on the tail end. So there were a fair few economic shocks in that period of time. And you look at things like even we looked at overseas, like a flight to London return. And amazingly, the costs for that, if you go to the early 1980s through the 1980s, was roughly the same dollars of today. It was about $2,000 for a return flight, but money was a lot more then than now. It took a lot more to earn $2,000 than it did today. In other words, the prices of things for certain things was higher back then when you compare it to how many weeks of work, for example. But the one thing the baby boomers and then the Gen Xers coming after did have in their favor was the median house price in a capital city like Melbourne or Sydney was about 5 times the average annual earnings. Just if we look at what the earnings were and what the house prices were, yes, wages have gone up, but house prices have gone up at an even faster rate. So when we look at housing today and we put ourselves in the shoes of perhaps a 20 or 30 something, so maybe the Gen Z or maybe a little bit up to the younger Gen Ys as they're starting their housing, thinking about starting a family and wanting to get a home. Yes, interest rates, though we might think they're a little high at 4.6%, they're a lot lower than they were at the double digit phase. Unemployment is very low. We've seen earnings go up a little bit over the last 5 or 6 years. We've got low inflation, again, relative to what we've had in the past. And some of the cost of living, like to buy a TV, if you put a cost of TV or electronics or a computer in earnings terms, it's cheaper than it's ever been before. We get a lot of cheap stuff from overseas, and relative to earnings, it's a lot lower. But the house prices are a lot more. So instead of the average house being 5 times average annual earnings, in a place like Sydney, you've got to take the average earnings. If you look at a full-time earner today, it's about $80,000. Wow, that sounds like a good earning, but you've got to multiply that by about 17 or 18 times to get that median house price that has long since surpassed the $1.5 million mark. So in that ratio form, from a 1 to 5 house was 5 times earnings. Now it's, depending on the capital, 15 up to 17 or 18 times. It's 3 times as expensive. So yes, lower interest rates, and yes, some good earnings, and yes, they've invested in themselves with higher levels of university qualifications, which will be good for their earnings ongoing. But the big expense of life is the house, and that's a lot more expensive than ever, and that's why they can't do it just with one income. They need two at a minimum. Often the bank of mum and dad is needed to help them get that deposit, and even then they're going to have longer mortgages than we've had in the past. So that's to weigh all of that up. Who had it tougher economically? I would say it is very hard for young people to get that economic start in life, which traditionally in Australia has been home ownership. And despite some favourable economic times, they are the tough ones that on the house price. That one big figure probably puts them a little bit in a tougher spot than the other generations had.
Now, Mark, on your website, you note 10 trends to prepare for over the next 10 years in Australia. And you say, and I quote, the decade to 2035 will feature many generational landmark moments in Australia. Population growth and generational changes are happening faster than ever. Leaders need to become futurists to find the opportunity amidst the disruptions that will occur. Is there any particular trend that is more immediate and in need of greater preparation as we move forward into these next 10 years?
Well, yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time looking at the demographics and the population and the generations really flows from that. And I think that's good to understand because it tells us our future. These demographic models are quite predictable. We can see the trends, we can see the changes, and our society is a collection of people. Our communities are made up of obviously, the people, the mix of ages and cultures, backgrounds, and attitudes. And so by understanding the population and those demographic factors, we can understand something of our future communities, our future organizations, and the nation. So I think that's a good place to start. And what we see at the moment is record low birth rates. We've never had lower births per woman, the total fertility rate or birth rate, than we have today at 1.5. So a couple needs to produce 2 children, just mathematically, to replace themselves. The official replacement rate is 2.1 because not every child born makes it to adulthood. But if every couple produces 2 children, then the theoretical reality is that's replacement rates. Well, we're well below that. And 1.5 means that we would, over the long term, have a population contraction. In fact, just take New South Wales as an example. In the last 12 months, New South Wales grew natural increase, births minus deaths, by about 25,000 people. But the net internal migration, as people shifted to out of New South Wales to other states relative to those who came to New South Wales from other states, so this internal churn was a net loss of a little over 25,000 people. So, in other words, without migration, overseas migration, if we just look within our nation, New South Wales would have had a population contraction, losing more people to the rest of Australia than it gained through birth. So that's the reality that we find ourselves in Australia. You've got places like South Australia and Tasmania with a much higher median age than the average. So 43 or 44 is the midpoint in the population of those two states. In the Northern Territory, it's a lot lower. It's 33 is the midpoint in age, so younger, and you get more births in a place like that with a younger population, but fewer births in some of our older states. And that gives a sense as to not only the aging curve on which we find ourselves, but the declining fertility curve as well. That's not just because of aging, it's because of cost of living and housing. And so couples are delaying starting their families. And even though they might have a child in their, well, it's now 32 for a woman giving birth and 34 for a father at the time that the spouse gives birth. They're older than ever, and they are just running out of time, and so having smaller children, fewer children and smaller families. So that's the aging side of it. And so at a policy level, the government's been leaning heavily on overseas migration to fill the skills gaps and to grow the population and stimulate the economy, because when there's demographic growth, you get a bit of that economic growth as well. And that's fine. That has that short-term sugar hit, if you like, for the economy. But it's now more than 85% of our growth, with 15% being that fairly slow population growth. And so we've got record migration, higher than we've ever had in our past. If we go back to 2004, our population increased by 104,000 people through migration, sort of the size of Ballarat, if you like, in a single year. If we wind it forward a decade to 2014, our population through migration, the net gain, population-wise through overseas migration, was twice that. It was about 210,000 people, about the size of Townsville, something like that. But a decade on to 2024, so 100,000, decade later, 200,000. 2024 last year, we grew by more than 530,000. So a all-time record by a long way, 500,000 people just through migration. The net increase, not the arrivals, because you got arrivals minus departures. That was the net gain after the numbers settle. 500,000 people in a year, which that's the size of Tasmania in a single year. So pretty phenomenal. And that's dialed down a little bit. The government's been saying we're dialing that down, and it has. 2025 looks like it'll be about 340,000, which is still well above any other year prior to the last few years. So we're at these record high migration levels, and that means we're more culturally diverse, and we have been for a long time, and connecting across that diversity. But it also does place pressure points on the economy in terms of demand for housing and services, and we're seeing those house prices rise. So we've got ourselves somehow caught in this vicious cycle of we need people to build homes because we need these 1.2 million homes. How are we going to do it? We can't get Australians to get into the trades. Well, let's bring in skills from overseas. Record numbers, and now we need record numbers of homes because we don't have enough homes for the demand of our population, and so you end up in this cycle which doesn't really achieve very much. So that's just the current policy settings. That's where we're at. That's the situation that we're in, and that's hard to, once you're on this. Once the economy and the university sector, which relies on overseas students, the employers that are looking for the quick fills in the vacancies, once they're geared up for that, as the government's finding, it's really hard to dial that down to 150,000, which has been our long-term average, or our average over the last couple of decades on average. So that defines the future a lot and gives us a sense as to where things are going as well. And I think the generational change, so what each generation is looking for and their expectations as the next generation moves into adulthood or the economy or work, their attitudes of what work is like, and family size and where we live and how we live and values and priorities and expectations, that defines the future as well. So I think those two factors of demographics and where we're headed and the generations and the changing attitudes, that really does define the future, and it's important for us to understand.
Well, Mark McCrindle, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you a guest at Monday Matters and to hear your insights, the results of your research, to make our community a better place to be. That's just invaluable, and we do appreciate that. And we congratulate you again on being able to celebrate 20 years of your functioning as an organisation. Mark, thanks so much for being our guest today.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone.